couple of things happened that are really very interesting. One is that the United Nations, in response, right, seeing that they don't have any power, they don't have any money, very little power, not running up against the problem that many of the governments, in fact most, if not all of the governments participating in the United Nations were thoroughly corrupt, right? And so if you had a deal with a government or with another government, you could never be sure where the money was going to go, right? And that's a problem when you're trying to rebuild, right, or recover, or develop, and whatnot. So they unleashed, they unleashed the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations. And it was a way of going around the state. It was a way of getting money into a country to do something. Rebuild agriculture, distribute care packages, that's how care got started, in which you didn't have to go through the central government because you were going to lose, 9/10 of it, right? And just to let you know, 90% of CARE's budget is spent in the United States. So when I talk about corruption, let's look at it from both sides of the coin. So the UN unleashes these government or these non-governmental organizations. Now at the same time, a phenomenon develops in the South, in Latin America, where people begin to analyze, they take a look at Rostow's piece of schlock and realize that that's what it is. It's just the work of a hack. And begin to look a little more deeply into it and say, no, wait a minute. The reason we're underdeveloped is because they are developed. They developed on our backs. So it doesn't make sense to say that we're going to follow in their footsteps, does it? And sort of the simple math will tell you that if you're selling raw materials, right, for your foreign exchange, and then you're buying manufactured materials and industrial goods, you're going to lose. You'll never be able to catch up if you're stuck because you sell cheap and you buy dear. That's the name of industrial capitalism. So they said, well, let's substitute. Let's make our own manufactured goods. Let's have our own industry. And that's called import substitution industrialization. So where the South would develop their own industry rather than buying from the North. That's a pretty good idea. Unfortunately, a number of things happened. One, they didn't have any money. So they had to borrow. Of course, the North was very happy to loan. So they had to borrow the money from the North. Then they had to buy the machines. I mean, you need machines to make machines, right? So they had to buy the machines. Well, who do they buy them from? The North. Now, did the North sell them the top-of-the-line machines so that they could compete in an open, level playing field? Of course not. They sold them the chatarra. They sold them what was left over. They sold them what they weren't using anymore. And they sold them the technology. They sent some people down, show them how to work the machines and whatnot. So then the South said, okay, fine, be that way. We're going to close our markets. We're going to raise our tariffs, and we're going to sell these goods to ourselves. So we know where that takes you, don't we? You won't be selling to yourself for very long, not if you want to stay in business. They had to open up. So where would they go to sell their goods? If you were Guatemala, where would you go to sell your two-burner gas stoves? You go to Honduras, right? Now, the problem with going to Honduras is that Honduras is making two-burner gas stoves, right? And so you've got to cut a deal. How about you make the refrigerators, I make the stoves? Right. All right, well, you need kind of a market. Establish a market for that. Well, unfortunately, most of Latin America had just gotten over almost 200 years of bloody civil war, and had established these boundaries and really weren't very trusting of each other. And very different levels of demand, right? Very low levels of demand and very different levels of demand. You know, effective demand, able to buy. And so the Central American common market struggled and struggled and struggled and struggled and never really got off the ground. And South America, you had some better experiences, but still kind of limped along. And then now we get up into the 60s and 70s. You have another development decade and another development decade. And all this time, you've got the North pushing the other direction. They're not interested in import substitution industrialization, right? They want to sell their products to you, and they want your raw materials. So enough of this foolishness. If you want money from us, stop. Don't do that. And there's a long struggle. So development has to be cast, the development that we all know and love, has to be cast within this struggle. From north and south, establishing different markets. This is all capitalism, right? I mean, you had socialist parties and communist parties and social democrats and Christian. At the end of the day, we're all talking about the same thing. ISI falls. The sort of the crowning blow or the nail in the coffin of ISI is the oil shocks, and then the financial crash. And basically, banks had loaned out all this money to the South. The South tried to build up their industry with this money. They weren't generating enough foreign exchange to pay back the money because they were selling to each other, right? And then the oil crisis hits in the 70s. OPEC holds back the oil, prices shoot up, everything sort of goes to hell in a handbasket, and at the same time, the United States gets involved in Vietnam and just inflates the world with its currency, as do the oil-producing companies. There's dollars just, flowing into the ocean. There's so many dollars flowing around. Incredible inflation. And, but these guys don't have them, and they can't pay them back. And so they go into the third world debt, which now seems silly, because I remember at the time we thought, oh my God, is it $30 billion? The debt. And now it's like, whew, we wish. In any case, ISI goes down, and the other project, which is the liberal project, which we now call the neoliberal project, coming out of the North, and it moves forward. And now you had the different Uruguay rounds and this and that and the other. Now we have the WTO, right? The World Trade Organization, whose job it is to break down tariffs and regulation for the free movement of capital investment and goods. So that's sort of the short history of development.